Embedded Contradiction by Michael Fahl, read by the author. Embedded Contradiction, an issuance of dissonance into contemporary philosophy, an introduction to Modular Truth, my book, philosophy book, on embedded contradiction in lieu of a final authority, a book for future diplomacy, as herein lies the rub. The problem with people is that they believe what they think. Michael Fahl, author. Everyone is fully communal and fully individual. When one is one with this fact, they intuit a paradox personally, and hence phenomenologically, one becomes aware of an embedded contradiction. We as people in dialogue and discourse can accept contradictions, allow them into discourse without rebuke, at first, and possibly in an ongoing manner. A description of specific language functions, perceptual differentiation, and a reapproach to logical primitives can assist us with indexing the minutiae of complexities found in logic per se, as well as discourse between opposing interlocutors. A user's guide to adequate usury of humans as mere chattel via decades and years of dogmatic conditioning is akin to decades of gaslighting young developing minds into not only believing that the complexity of indexing contradictory communication is too complex to comprehend, but that only fractions of this complexity might be able to be comprehended. This is to say, convince people that since they don't actually know if seemingly contradictory complexities could be well indexed, but that it is inescapably impossible to do so. Therefore, this leaves populations of people, even intellectuals, especially ignorant in their belief that they are capable of fettering out their differences by virtue that the other isn't making logical or reasonable sense. Instead, convince them that communication, in all of its seeming infinitude, cannot ever quite be indexed fully, totally, or at least adequately robust to resolve all seemingly contradictory disagreement. Many might contend that the whole operation of analysis of dialogue could never be robustly indexed and indexed properly to resolve the most complex variations. Let the world of modern people persist in the continuance that they are never able to actually understand another person fully, and that such an attempt to do so on its face is absurd. Let people slavishly continue importing an intellectual barrier between one another, which thwarts acceptance of the other's seemingly absurd or contradictory statements, points of view, at the first notice that there is a breach of standard logical protocol, aka a fallacy or contradiction. Continue to gaslight intellectuals to persist in solidifying a like Platonic ideal of intellectual formations which they believe not unlike a queer version of logical positivism, whereby one's paradigm seems to be solid and limited to the positivity of the intellect via formal logical rules, despite other phenomena occurring in the world which has been and continues to be glossed over, namely the indexing of phenomena outside of the law of non-contradiction and beyond the law of the excluded middle. The hope of this writing is in part to get the reader to accept contradictions when they are confronted with them, absorb them in a non-forgetful way, as a river has shoreside eddies which trap and spin the marginal excesses of the river into circular, almost fully parsed-off patterns of water movement. And after allowing the contradictions denoted and ascribed by the reader listener as such to set them aside for a while before attempting to thwart their interlocutor's greater expressions by demanding that they have not yet resolved the contradiction which has been detected. The person detecting the contradiction should refrain for a while, like water caught up in an eddy, in order to determine what they aren't understanding about their interlocutor, such that person whom detected also ascribed a contradiction or contrary notion to the other's expression in the first place. And if one is sincere to do so to the point of self-other exhaustion or abandonment, this restraint can be held while realizing that what one was initially going to call a thought, speech, or logical violation as a contradiction or fallacy, greater context which the contradiction is embedded within, which itself needs more patience and greater reservation to be addressed than immediately attempting to subjugate their opponent to the commonly held rails of proper logical form. This is a technique of methesis, where patience before engagement furthers empathetic insight into the other's paradigm. This allowance as technique puts the dialogue itself outside of a competitive framework and a utility for winning or convincing another towards correctness, rightness, or truthfulness. It allows the further and fuller context of the other to be noted. This assumes that all people have a domain of hypocrisy which contains contrary or contradictory notions and beliefs, which they most often have subdued or displaced into their subconscious or continue to rub a blind's eye over. The relational forms of meaning and approach to one's own word's intent as expressed, and those words' relationship to any other words of anyone else's meaning of the words which they themselves speak, which you also register as words at least, and have an understanding of, if not in full then in part, or at least derive some aspect of meaning which allows the instantiation of meaning to have some semiotic register. And in some cases, granting over an attribution of meaning to conjure or speculate assumptively, and understanding in one's own mind to compete with what one is not actually apprehending from the other. In the worst scenario, one attributes too much meaning to the other. In the best case, one might have evoked an idealized form of the content or structure of grammar or form of meaning within their mind as a signified, mentally corresponding geometric shape, as if the rules of discourse and meaning had a true and relevant corresponding shape to them, their meaning, the import of a meta-analog. This writing means to diagram grammar and relational aspects of discourse, contradiction, and meaning in graphical displays which spatialize that which is most often constrained to text and writing. With this periodic graphical meta-analog, I expect misunderstanding to arrive at best and disagreement via logical ambivalence at worst. I reasonably conclude that the future of logic will entail graphically conceived forms which run parallel, or as side notes to formal logic. Propositional logic and set theory notation, if we cannot disentangle and reappropriate what may currently be viewed as eccentric, graphics to categorize domains of philosophical variables and components comparatively to contemporary conventions of modern logic, then the continued displacement, disregard, and benign contempt for contradictions will keep a world of competing theories unresolved, irreconcilable, and non-disambiguated. The virtues of discourse and conventional logic, which abide to the root principles, laws of logic, are demonstrably needed. In order to solve mundane and complex problems within the utilitarian aspects of the, or their, world, yet paraconsistent and nostalgic forms of logic can be applied to the domains of non-utility with regards to human discourse and verbal, textual, dialogical exchange. In this case, the hope is to generate intersecting realms of non-empirically corresponding reference, which give psycho-philosophical insight into another paradigm, history of conditioning and foundational claims. An empathy develops by delving into the other's complexity of being and thinking, in spite of assuming that the other holds contradictory edicts. To perform this technique of approach temporarily at first, but later on, long enough to become conscientious of the magnitude of distinctive contrary elements, such that a domain of non-disregarded elements are observed and collected of the other in a locular tour, such that the more robust level of diplomacy emerges. This writing is to help one dive into the foundations of held beliefs, knowledges, and foundational roots generally, such as to challenge the dogmas of coherence and intellectually held justifications, which one at this stage believes them to be. For those whom seek truth as a singular apprehension, whether via internal, logical, or associative properties, or have the ability to meaningfully correspond to their thoughts' formations, signifieds, to the empirical world as well as to the non-empirical world of ideas, forms, and concepts, eidetic items, may find this writing unvirtuous or antithetical to their current grounds of being. To desolidify and defound the conditioned groundwork of one's world, education, and psyche is akin to entering into the mind of a schizophrenic, and abandon the negative connotations while enveloping the pathologies and disjuncts which paraconsistent logics and embedding contradiction can afford one. Not a quest for truth, but a quest for underlining and understanding, yielding empathetic discourse to blossom. New logics, in all of their newly indexable minute formations, can be reapplied to traditional propositional analysis and truth functions without necessarily dismantling nor deconstructing their constituent parts. I would like to, conceptually speaking, open borders and immigrate variables from perceptual psychology as a field into the philosophical canon, such that at least a diffuse intersectional domain is discoverable. Later on, the separate fields should inculcate the other and allow considerations of each, any to envelope the other, like a storm front moving in, enveloping a space, and dissipating. The irony of writing about contradiction is that you have to use non-contradictory sentiments, statements, assertions, ideas with coherence to denote contradictions, to speak about them. How can you start? Assume the lingual grounds which we were taught and conditioned into our common language-speaking beings, such that a coherent epistemological framework could emerge from an infantile, prelingual, ambiguous time of being. And then, almost suddenly, rationale and reason, measure and understanding, occurrence, and at once we could speak with rudimentary clarity to those who already entered into the language. Now consider cultivating one's mind and being in all of life's expectational goals, understandings, explorations, advancements, for the sake of acquisition, reproduction, furtherance, and vitality, where language and its grammatical rules and functions were gifted tools for greatness or mere contentment. A life underscored with understanding, belief, knowledge, ego, sense of self as a creature, and as a formation of intellect, such that no other species on earth could measure nor compete. Now imagine a pinnacle of maintenance of one's thoughtful and considerate need to drive themselves to the extremes of intellectual pursuit in one or more various fields of study, such as to master the field and carry oneself and humanity forward in the work accomplished along this ideal path accomplished. Now consider those whose dreams and insight and ways of being are not fulfilled, fleshed out, who live less than ideal lives, whose lives were corrupted via some variable, and who now cannot and will not live up to their potential. Imagine granting oneself over to empathizing with those who are of less, have less, seem in essence less lucky, less able. Imagine the thrust of one's personal idealism becoming thwarted via not mere sympathy, but empathy and empathizing with those defunct. Now imagine finding a virtue in helping those whom live defunct lives as at the expense of oneself. Here's the stage where I would like one to enter into a philosophy of contradiction beyond merely being a contrarian of the ironic, sarcastic sort, but as an exercise in exploring the world of the primitive and primordial. At least to do this without a safety line at first, imagine now entering back into your pre-lingual self, your pre-logical, pre-reasonable, pre-rational self. What gems could be extracted from that domain of being? One way to start an indexing of contradiction is to first imagine a derailment from the rules, which formulate one's ground for non-contradiction. And why? If logic and reason is possibly considered to be authoritarian by its mere presence, allowing contradiction is a process of dissonance. Pardon. One may ask what the benefit of such a anti-philosophy to be, and the answer is meta and para and extra and super and supra and post contextual whilst being about oneself in time, presence, being, incarnation, and vastness of purpose, even perennial in the imaginative form. In the face of a new technological landscape with all of its salient psychological repercussions, humanity needs a new esoteric philosophic approaches which describes more appropriately the landscape of contentions which are competing as truth. The contemporary orthodox epistemologies are in need of a graduation and development, where any philosophies and philosophical elements are considered as philosophic components and are able to be applied to a fixed or unfixed model. I'm purporting a modular epistemologic framework, which culminates alongside as well as educates within the landscape of first-person, virtual reality, graphical domains, whereby the shared graphics in real time elucidate philosophical models via supplementary graphics well beyond that of mere propositional analysis. Without outrightly kicking propositional analysis into the junk heap of history, we instead necessarily retain it as but one module, which is usable as a rudiment of a grand model. The model is variably transformable and is hence adaptive and mutable, whereby currently we still have people yammering about, insisting on truth and truths of matters, from the most minute of grand overarching religious narratives, to which modular truth will more accurately describe the case in matters of the internal, mental, imaginable, descriptive, empirical, philosophic, religious, political cases, etc., etc. The retention of epistemology as being locked necessarily to its past is pawned with a statement I made in verbal online discourse recently when speaking about the history of Western philosophy and its thinkers. I said, I notice that the authors we read from the past make up most of your current thoughts. I'm wondering if any of you could quote an author from the future. I think that might be more insightful. In order to describe truth as modular, we have to first modulate truth, so to speak. There will require a disjunct away from the adherences claimed as necessary by many, and a most rudimentary disjunct will take place at regarding contradiction as a stopping point. In all cases when a contradiction is met, I promote that you reassess not a fixation about your convictions, about the case, the truth, etc., but instead attempt to granulate your interlocutor's position in such a way as to not disregard their argument in whole, but to refine your search for the minute aspects of what they are saying, which remains in contradiction in your claim, conviction. This may seem daunting, and you may tritely and adamantly remain in contention, such that the contradiction is not surpassed. At this point, the thesis is here for you, such that you also granulate your own position and disposition, non-permanently, such that you can index the minutiae of the disagreement in a methodological manner which should treat and resolve the problem at hand while expanding your spectrums of meaningful discourse. Diction. Noun. 1. The choice and use of words and phrases in speech or writing. 2. The style of enunciation in speaking or singing. A non-semantic yet somewhat semiotic series of arguments to consider your fear, reluctance, as well as your perceived sense of good sense and sensibility itself, let alone care for oneself, and whom and what one cares about. Let us begin. Chapter. Primer. Preface of Graphamines as Exercises. Dixie Cup on a String, the Postal Service, and Memory. It's not just remembering versus memory loss. It's not immediately remembering something coupled with the socially imposed guilt about not remembering. Regularly occurring memories with lingual coordination within the cadence of knowing what you are talking about in real conversation is needed for engaging in dialogue. Note the assumed delays in communication today, 2018, is that most communication can be deferred to one's smartphone. Historically, the phone can be perceived as the first technological social standard of business to which communication and discourse with the outside world in real time occurred, by which an infrastructure or shared ecology of technology was required as means of this communication. One's business is what seems to define the encapsulated pockets of one's doing as well as one's doing for acquisition of funds. The ecology of one's economy as an accepted paradigm or accepted ground from which most all believe, most all have to consider to survive and thrive in a world with money. Money is to people socially as gravity is to objects physically. They are both rudiments. Tell me something that no one knows in the universe except you. Disturb ants. Initiation. Disturbance. An initiation. Disturbance as equivalent to an initiation. A disturbance is a breach of equilibrium, an average water table, which initiates one to the volatility which comes from difference, disjointedness, separation, and generally referring to that which was a noun as a verb. One is initiated into change and punctuated change. Between quality and quantity, not quality and. It is important to not confuse what is similar with what is different. Yet it is more important not to confuse what is similar with what is the same. And alternatively, it is important to find the difference between two items claimed to be the same. I lost more footing some time back, defoundational philosophy via the graphemine, the phomine, language and linguistics in general, and an understanding of philosophical triptychs and exceptions. Lines of reasoning, trends of thought, trend lines of being, trending timelines of living, streams of thought, 3 streams of thought converging, schools of fish swimming, schools of thinking, schools of thought which make up what's popular, and popularity, practice and conditioned into via indoctrination of the way it is and the direction of the schools of children, full of nihilistic optimism. My idea, but Raven's idea for a t-shirt. My, Little Richard. Among the word, the thought, and the referent, a lot can go on, and hence a lot can go wrong. Wrong with indexing meaning. Supposing that one could hear a word being spoken and not have a thought signified flash before their mind's eye, and yet still know or seek out a referent within their senses. Certainly some people have this relationship with words, and I assume that this happens quite often. Some might even think it indicative of the zombie problem in certain philosophical schools. It's like an autonomic bodily process, like swallowing, which your body does that your mind doesn't always notice. And by notice, I mean have represented in your mind in some abstract representation. That is to say, your mind doesn't produce a signified every time you swallow. At least I wouldn't attest to having one, nor do I have one whenever my heart beats. For the longest time, I assumed that the significance and the referent were synonymous. Must have been because of my lack of reading certain continental philosophers and because I was used to thrusting my mind's vision outward onto a canvas so often that had me thinking that one can do away with always having a mind full of images whenever one is using language. I certainly don't see in my mind the word the whenever I hear someone say it, or if I say it myself. So we can dispense with the signified as being that which is always necessary. Although I won't say that the signified can be done away with entirely in one's life's use of language, merely that the signified is often in suspense, in a form of being absent, so often absent. And to what statistical extent could science measure amongst a population of common language-speaking people attesting to almost always having a vision of a referent in their mind, especially when they engage in conversation or have general interaction with a text? Certainly the word general, in my just previous use, did not conjure up a military figure as a signified in one's mind, and more than likely did not conjure up an overinflated, delineated boundary surrounding less general items of the thought either. So it is in contradiction to insist that the memory of sensing an item, no matter how recent that sensing took place, is not, in fact, the same as sensing the item initially. Once again, so it is not a contradiction to insist that the memory of sensing an item, no matter how recent that sensing took place, is not, in fact, the same as sensing the item initially. Isn't the idea of one's memory a type of tautological measure, a reapproach, a refocusing upon in one's mind of an event firstly noted by one or more of the supposed 5 organismal senses? One might say yes or no, or shrug, or not acknowledge, or do whatever as a response to this question. I aim here to point out the obvious, that sensing an item is different than remembering the item sensed. Could one not say that they are doing both at the same time? That is, both sensing an item and remembering that a second ago that they were sensing the item. Is having a data stream of sensed input in contradiction to the definition of the word memory, or in contradiction to the conventional use of the word memory? And here I'm not alluding to seeing a familiar item and remembering a past relationship, but instead sensing an item and without blinking or falling asleep or having your attention averted, say, I'm simultaneously sensing and remembering this item, which prior to this very moment event I have never encountered before. Certainly a different case would be if the item was not a sensed object in the world, but instead an item of discourse. So that the item of discourse is a topic about what one imagined another person to be talking about. The topic would be general and would include all the constitutive signifieds which arose in both the speaker and the listener's imagination. And here I want to define that a signified is that mental image that appears as representation or stand-in for a word, concept, or item of the world. In this case, imagine that the speaker is now speaking about an abstract item in an abstract context and is not referencing any object in the world. Perhaps a relational quality amongst many variables was being pondered, considered, or thought about while speaking. How could the listener, the receiver of the abstract topic, derive any verification that what they thought about to themselves, what they imagined via the signifieds arising in graphical, visual form, or thought-sound form in their mind, had any comparable association to what the individual doing the pondering, the considering, and speaking was actually speaking about? Without further articulation and clarification, until some sort of ecstatic identification with the speaker's story, could one think that their signifieds represented that of the speaker. The speaker would have to agree with the listener's descriptive articulations about the topic at hand. at hand in order to be on the same page during the dialogic exchange, aka the conversation about the conversation. Even further than that, they would both need to be capable of further articulation in the case that a third party wanted to understand what the speaker and listener were talking about. In all cases, agreement or claims of understanding exactly is merely a claim. A claim or reiteration that those conversing sense that minutia, topic, subject, concept, idea is the same, agreed upon enough that the conversation can go on. Comparing the graphic images, the signifieds, which arose in all of the participants' mind's eyes, would be all but impossible, perhaps. Very soon, sharing the creative virtual reality space with multiple people might allow one to make a project their visually graphic representation of what their individual signifieds were, such that all parties could see this. This technology certainly furthers a realm of agreement whereby the speaker could design a representation of items of thought as substitutes for their thought. This will reduce the difference between what the listener imagined and what the speaker was attempting to convey. Emojis are a very primitive meta and meta-lexical inclusion of what I'm suggesting. Yet, like any visual artistic venture, the process of creating an image for objective visual consumption would not be an exact duplicate of that which was actually signified in the artist's mind. Even if the artist ardently insisted that what they produced was an exact duplicate of what they had imagined, there would be, currently, no way of verifying this. At some point, the viewer of the artifact or listener would simply have to take the progenitor's word for it. Not as true, but so the conversation could continue. And the artist would simply continue to insist that it was in their mind the way it was posited in virtual reality. The three-dimensional digital art would have similar problems to listening to the words one is speaking. Namely, we say that we understand and understood the basic or general idea of what the speaker artist was conveying. We are less accustomed to saying that we understand what the artist is sensing internally. Laying a string of artifacts for others to move through, whether words or images or artifacts, is informative without necessarily being informative of anything in the other's mind. Hence humans say, I wish I could read your mind, or I wish I could be in your head, or I bet your head is a scarier nice place to be in, or in some cases, I wish I knew what it was like to be you. So I approach conclusion. If we can never really know what it is to be another person, to walk in their shoes, and empathy is merely a greater approximation of sympathy towards another person, then all of what we suppose of another is an enhancement of agreements or congruities within a common human organism's ability to construct language of agreement and understanding. When we cannot point out what is shared between two people, but insists that there are some common internal variables, one might say, we are not dissimilar to one another. Opposed to saying the two of us are similar, or share similar attributes, or share an internal subjective consensus, etc. Where the first statement understood leaves what is similar open and obscure, the latter statement most often entails a furtherance as to what it is that is in common amongst the participants when what is said is observed as being understood. Not to become pedantic here, but the point of this above writing is to illustrate that we live in a state of difference which is shared by our common grammar and grammatical rules and history of humans who are embedded within a history of human behaviors and conventions, conditions, and conditioned tongues. Is it fair to say that we, by virtue of not being the same organisms, that we live in most manners in contra to one another? Is it fair to say that when we articulate descriptive qualities about who we are, how we feel, what we think, etc., that we will find a differing use of words and preference within language? Would it be fair to insist that we each have different diction? That is to say, we choose to use different words and word patterns and patternings from one another. If you agree with me that we do speak with differing diction and we live in contra to all others, then would you agree that we live, part and parcel, in contradiction with one another, between and among one another? Although this is not the entire basis of this writing, this is a good illustrative ground to begin our pondering of what a contradiction is, and how contradictions are, and a noticing of when they arise, and when and how is it appropriate to consider contradiction to be true. Maybe delete this next bit as you've mentioned it above. Of course, this above has nothing to do with how often one has signifieds flash before their conscious mind. And of course, then one's conscious ability to articulate and name this domain would be that of the subconscious or unconscious. Simply a naming of that which is there unknowingly, or that which hold potential to arise in some graphic, possibly geometric mental form, a Platonic form imagined, as if one could say that the word mountain, and one could imagine a particular mountain, then in a general mountain shape, and then, or concurrently imagine a triangle, noting then the association between the word mountain and the shape of a triangle. So the speaking to another person, one does not know if to whom they are speaking sees things the same way that they do upon engagement of a conversation, especially if that person is a stranger, even if the stranger speaks the same language. The ontolog, the volley of cherry-picked diction from the grand lexical constellations to utter lingually across and breath one's tongue to rub one's retina via pupil contradictions, skull muscles guiding, conventionally now left to right over the text, this graphic font-shaped, historically devised, atomized series of graphemes, expressions from human hands in dirt, chalk to stone, through time, ink to papyrus, pen to paper, stamp wax to linen, printing press to the wisps of industrialized bleached tree pulped mash, to personal, mechanical typing machines, to lined or blank, well-cut, standardized 8 by 11 inch paper on a hand-twisted roll, from the analog to the digital typeface of typography, digital font, digital kerning, juxtaposed against graffiti tags, to the freedom to and from internet forms and formalism, the reduction to blog font size and spacing, and the wafting again to greater personal expression of text, although not so often as graffiti artists brought into technical texts. Next chapter. Not to become pedantically semantic with a whirlwind of woo-woo sophistry. A. There is that which is contra with other things, that which is contrary to other things, variables, and there are contradictions. Types of contradiction. Contradictions can have a semantic colloquial definition in which we articulate that something is contrary to another thing, like hooking mice up to pull a regular-sized car, or saying that the sun didn't rise today when the sun most basically defines what a day is, or that a sun gave the illusion of rising. And then there is the more logically fundamental type of contradiction, namely, that an item that both is and isn't cannot be equated to itself. X does not equal not X. I will address these, semantic and logical, not for all X's, X equals X. B. But first want to note that the referent and the signified differ from one another. In the first case of contradiction, whereby mice could not fulfill the utility of pulling a regular-sized car, the mice are the items being referenced, and so is the buggy. When one is learning English, they sophomorically use a referent to refer to objects in the world which are considered empirically accessible within reality nature. When one is a bit more sophisticated, then they can begin referring to words, abstract, signifies, and pure symbolic logic, or an item variable, which is defined by an associated word. The referent moves beyond object items of the world into symbol and sign items, items of discourse, shared ideas of imagination, without sharing the same image of the imagination. So referents migrate from either objects in the world or any conceivable or definable variable. Modern technical 3D graphics allow the imagination to mutate into a referent of for the mind. If a contradiction was performed with your eyes, contravision would be what one sees off in the distance when crossing one's eyes at the tip of their nose. A different contra is an alter effect in one's eye after looking away from a bright light, is contra to what the after effect is covering over in one's regular line of sight, yet perhaps after staring at a bright light and then looking at a lawn, in that affected subdomain of vision, the grass appears is glowing light blue. C. Instead of crossing one's eyes, when 1/5 of your awake life is spent under closed eyelids blinking, it is absurd to think that the object of reference isn't 1/5 in contravision, contra-color vision, to what the object's color aspects are regularly said to be. When one stares at a color and then closes their eyes, orange becomes blue, red becomes green, purple becomes yellow, and vice versa, etc. Even though the contrary color is chemically occurring, we are not conditioned to recognize or concern ourselves with this ongoing phenomena which accompanies our blinking eyes, and our dreams moving in contra to the contra colors of our closed eyes arise, in general, from the mind when the world of objects is cut off. Multisensory contra claims. When a noise is directly behind you, it is often perceived as being in front of you. What the ears perceive runs contra to what your eyes can see. During the duration of time that one hears the sound without verifying the source with sight, there is a perceived contradiction, which is ameliorated when one recognizes that this has occurred in one's past and that the solution to the sensory non-corroboration is that the source of the sound is opposite their initial sensory assumptive instinct. D. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Being both descriptive and true is a true contradiction, provided that the word it in both cases is referring to the same condition. The word times is referring to the same parenthetical history, where best and worst are regarded as opposites. If one permits oneself to abstract sentence structure and content into spatial diagrams, not dissimilar to crossing one's eyes, we can imagine an intersection denoted in the following graph. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. syntactically correct, but the square circle, which is also not traditionally logically correct, where the lingually binary opposites, best and worst, are subject to the same domain in contra, a y-axis. The whole statement, and yes, the whole paragraph from Dickens' novel, is meant to imbue paradox to the reader. Now, up above, I've stated that this phrase is both descriptive and true, is a true contradiction. But am I correct in saying that it is a true contradiction? This requires another intersectional domain. For in one case I'm speaking of contradiction in a general colloquial sense. But in modern logic, contradiction would be it was the best of times, it was not the best of times in direct negation, and not merely the semantical interchange of paradox with contradiction. Alt opening. Is it okay to lie? Everything in this book is a lie. Regular liar's paradox. Consider the yield of the inverse liar's paradox. Nothing is true. If nothing applies to this sentence itself, the orthodox way of considering it is that the sentence exists but has no truth value. But what could we say about what the content or speaker intended to say or speak on by using this sentence? Perhaps the speaker is speaking upon a type of global skepticism. Of course, the best way to mess with a logical absolutist is to propose that all of what I'm going to say is a lie, opposed to the ramifications of knowing that lying fully is impossible, yet different than lying specifically. So it is true, in fact, that I am lying to you as much as you personally must assume that I am, and not lying to you to the same underlying or great extent or affect. There must be the ability to conceive a construction of language which, as an attribute, allows for an ongoing series of variable and interchangeable word vocabulary as options and subsets, i.e. verbs, adjectives, nouns, in an order which outline a language as distinct from arbitrary marks and sounds, as a grammar has having a grammar. For this understanding, a comprehension is obtained, and from this comprehension of grammar of a particular and understood language, content and meaning is conveyed. It is only from this stage that one can speak or understand what is being said, and from what is being said or written, one first assumes that the articulated conveyances are referencing commonly accepted facts about variables in the world, or items, language of discourse, i.e. ideas, concepts, etc., and that these conveyed references are true insomuch as that one can agree that the referent maps the item being referenced. It is only after all of this is in practice that one can deem that a subset or particular portion of what is being said to be false or untrue relative to the broader pre-accepted or practice engagement within the language system. So the statement, everything in this book is a lie, is itself not true, but only a subset or portion or aspect of the content within the structure of that statement of language is a lie. To denote the differences between all and none and all and some is often a hard lesson to learn. When you're developing asymmetrical attitudes towards sophisticated and nuanced differences amongst connected and associated ideas. Lattice and flux. The lattice of the structure of language defined as grammar, refined to proper use, in a conjunctive operation with the variable flux of trafficked vocabulary, define in part meaning. Rules of grammar denote the lattice of the structure of languages, where grammar and its rules point to conjugation in practice. The conventional use of symbols, words, icons, predicates, and punctuation in a standardized way of speaking, writing, and or gesturing defines the orthodoxy of a language. It's a langue. It is the langue which allows language historians to intuit languages, developmental overlays, shared elements, and attributes, giving rise to a thesis or picture of languages' history. Languages' histories. Where computers and most widely used internet font preferences tend to standardize our text and orientation to data on a screen in such a way as to forget or lay as historically remnant a more graphically differentiated mode of pre-internet handwritten and font expression, such as graffiti text or tags, became an aesthetic which the modern speed and expectation for speed in modern communicative states, having increased significantly the style of handwriting as not only an art form, an exercise of the hand, and what was possible with art and its creation is gnarly in its subsidiary semantics, to say the least. Being able to read sensibly and coherently anything at all, which I have thus far mentioned. For it is here where the absolutist fails to see their limits, limits bound up in the absence or the necessary outline of grammatical convention which denote consistent forms. Now that the internet has vastly prolificated information digitally, handheld books are utilized less often within the population than times prior. Where computers emit light opposed to books reflecting light, where computers absent light, books absorb light, there is now a distinctive shift in humanity's media use and engagement. For the television through the nuclear age, we are now radiated and differ our eyes into radiance, not unlike staring at the sun through dark lenses. Our ancestral attendance to books, magazines, and material print may be copied into the virtual practice of reading a book in future virtual reality, holodeck-like environments. Modern media, contrarily, flips the meaning and connotation of the avant-garde into that which is orthodox and nostalgic. Writing, reading, and handling items like books, papers, magazines, posters will be a greater and greater rarity in practice, production, and commodification in the future, I suspect. Meanwhile, computers and books opposed to just books increase our mutual standardization of language, like the lattice of grammar which outlines language and its contents. A describer of nihilism's presence and direction towards increasing nihilism might describe this text as moving into that direction. This is commonly felt by the tension of one's telos relative to one's offspring's or next generation's telos and well-being. I think if people have children and raise children, that they are more likely to view this text's theme beyond its psychological implications and with little consequence for themselves but a huge consequence for their children. The civic relation of adults who are now confined to the habitual artifice or maintenance of conservative speech may, in absence of their children and with no immediate regard for them, speak freely with other adults liberally and unconstrained. I like to call this idea's domain of adult-to-adult conversation adult swimming, named after the late-night television series by the same name, Adult Swim. Anything goes free speech. Here is where the axis towards nihilism is able to be presumed but reconsidered in a different limelight, such as to not necessarily be akin to nihilism, but nonetheless be ignoble. Adult swimming, in its less than noble formality, replaces nihilism per se for decadence or uncouth topics, which may float or sustain meaning regardless of being devoid of idealism. Then again, my assumption here is based on a notion that parents always wear a noble mask of some sort in front of their children with regards to topic, genre, or themes of conversation. The assumption is that a contextual protective layer is always in practice via the parent. To those who are not necessarily dogmatic about retention of communication limits, but tend to adhere or stick to them extensively, overt expressions of speech can cause repudiation of whole conversational environments, like nightclubs or an internal psychological torrent. A social agitation emerges which can often frustrate others and individual. Once again, the frustration and insistence that this text, or that the intent of this text is towards nihilism, is pathologically found in parents more so than in non-parent adults. This liberal domain is also prevalent in non-parent and post-parenting parents' conversation. I say this based on my interactions and dialogue with these two classes of seasoned adults. I also speculate inductively that this is the case based on the frequency, yet this is said stereotypically. Imagine hearing a story about scientists who get drunk in order to de-inhibit themselves, and in the de-inhibiting process find, discover, imagine a solution or correction to some problem. Suppose some of these scientists are pathological towards alcohol and secretly addicts. And they are parents who take this new de-inhibited practice home in front of their children. Compare that to the healthy, non-drinking, non-parent, mid-30s rock climber and cave dweller who consider themselves to be civil and polite in all dialogues. If both of these types read this text and discovered an identifiable nihilism within the text, this text per se, the scientist's pathos might find this text personally damaging, where the hardy and healthy climber may not. What is subsumed in a text is also the presumption going into the text, namely one of contradiction. This is one reason why rereading a text is so amazing. In the case of a book about contradiction, the text upon a second read, one might suspect would eat itself, but does it? Historic conventions and seriousness of worldwide attempts at solving the problems of our world are being reshaped and reordered. The lattice of shifting possibilities is as broad as humans can conceive and convey, relay, and propagate such ideas. In one hand, and in the other robot arm and hand, we have AI, which is also a player down to the human and into the human and through the human, the spirit, the being, the body as locus, the mind as bended and knotted together as it can be mistaken for that which is neither mental nor spiritual, nor platonic nor grounded in the body, but requires them all. Their intersection is multivariate. This is the domain of the me and the other. This is where you don't know who is in Westworld, TV show where social behavior has no consequence, and who is valuable within this world. Whether from finding oneself optically centered within the Truman Show or within a pan-psychistic solipsism, we can enjoy bivalence and dissonant bivalence. We can speak of the non-body, non-spirit, non-mental domain. We do not mean to speak of domain in any manner other than its inverted meaning, a relegation of non-definitive, absent variable, like a palimpsest. This is akin to realizing the truth of another culture as not reducible to the truth of one's culture, yet both have real-world and positive yield growth and sustenance, assuming they are both flourishing biologically regardless of difference. And by this I mean like a sock placed on inside out. The domain of the opposite, other, is actually the absence of a domain. Instead of how left parenthetical, right parenthetical, we have left parenthetical, left inner parenthetical, right exterior parenthetical, or bracket. The domain is edited by all of what is possibly assumed about the topic, an appearance of nihilism. Right parenthetical, left parenthetical. In this case, spirit, mind, body without correspondence to material, nor the material world reality is only pointing to others' relationship to their deontologically driven yet radically differing myths. If applied to oneself, the topic of a non-mind, a blind foreign source, using our minds and our language, pushing us forward casually and dragging us about towards our destiny and presumed end, telos, language being internally exterior and exteriorly internal, describing the first paradox of this writing, that we are both fully communal and fully individual, may allow the crease, bend, twist, or inversion to be indexed categorically, communally, amongst thinking peers. The acquisition of this insight, which is not claimed rationally as being of the self, is foreignly populated and buttressed against knowing that one now knows what it didn't know prior, which is that the opposite anterior of all of their truth claims. One here does not seek truth per se, but does not seek the crease, the edge, the comparison, whether one is able to find it, that which is self and reflection of the other, both mistaken and not mistaken as themselves. The description of it is questionable, and the indexing of that which is beyond the limits of sensible insight is probably limited to a phrase like, "We know there are things that we don't know." If rules are all of that matter, then content matters little at all. The postmodern dictionary or word salad is levied against the author or speaking whose constituent audience cannot understand what information is pertinent to being attended to, cherry-picked from the text and given meaningful constraints and restraints for their audience to deem as worthwhile, worth their time. Their while, their time. It is here that we know that we are humans first and also spirits first in the most hylomorphistic way. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. Next chapter. Caveats of logic. Contradictions exist for the same reason illusions exist. Craig, a.k.a. Piro 314. Agnosticism is known due to its contrast with things that aren't in doubt nor disclarity. But the negative agnosticism, or reverse Gnosticism, or reverse knowledge acquisition at this point stage is what you find when you cannot not be agnostic, because the clarity about a clear, non-agnostic stem, source, or presence was never clear, and clarity itself was like having one's hands thrown up in the air, indicating a shrug of not knowing when one is confronted with something they could not ever know, in the sense that the experience, conclusion, or data itself was not available, and if available was not discrete in any definite way, or the puzzle was not solved nor solvable by that human, nor any previously appearing human to date. That is, at least in the mind of the person whom was doing the shrugging. Contradiction is first and foremost a form of diction, and hence it is mostly brought about, fettered out, and fleshed out in general acts of speech and in botanical acts of speech. In any form of speech which affects a bodily, emotional, or physical state, which in turn affected the behavior of the person who has registered such forms of words and registered them well within their native, foreign tongue's grammar as diction. And in this case, the case for contradiction is the specific type of grammar that shows incompatible intersections of thought and supposedly necessary entanglements that accompany the item in question or acquisition of being in contra to itself, as disagreement is found most within, between dialogues, and hence dialects, concerning the content of the dialogue or the grammar framing the elements, functions, conventions, etc. of the dialogic content or process itself. And it is due to this English history of the prefix, dia, and its shared reference to the domain of philosophy called dialetheism, coming from the phenomenological vantage where a bounding an x of a meaning with a mental image signified its opposite, not x, is a type of psychological contradiction. The domains of imagination and meaning intersected, yielding a contradiction in this case. Let's say a man remembering seeing his mother speak the words, "I'll never die," at some historic time in his past, while also remembering his mother's lifeless body post-mortem. The X, meaningful content of the words of the mother's overlaying the memory of her being dead, the never-dying X, meaning, and the not X, eidetic image, memory of her dead, lifeless body. Like the lines which compose the letter Z or N. There are three components which define the intrapersonal contradiction here. The first is auditory memory of the mom, speaking the words, the trailing meaning of those words, accompanying the mental appearance of her mom's lifeless body, along with the third component, the experience of the distinction between the two, not being important to the son remembering the situation this way. Because the distinction of the collapsing collapsed chronological ordering when speaking about item X, where X is his mother, conveying meaning verbally, but remembered as being lifeless, such that the dead body could not, therefore speak the words, is conflated or layered over the other. In this case, the meaning of the words found within the stylized and synthesized memory found the importance. This memory lives in the diachronic, conflated, and duplicitous state when it is representational memory. Representational memory is preferenced over remembering meaning. Representational memory is often just called memory, but requires a one-to-one isomorphism to historic engagement with a spatio-temporal location and item or object. This type of memory differs from a memory of, let's say, an old friend asking you, conceptualize. Meshing a camel into an elephant body, then after waiting a moment asks you to paint it pink, and how this is all within the mind, and how is this all within the mind, and how is this signified abstract, also in contrast to with the presence of concurrent visual input. An analogy would be paying attention to the road while driving a car while at the same time apprehending the reflection of an item on your dashboard. Or eyeball focus is on the fingertip, yet one's attention is upon the doubled background and the background items. diagram. Close my eyes, I've got double vision. My double vision's got the best of you. Foreigner, band song. To understand, but not use these distinctions from the philosophical canon, because there are other ways to skin a cat. But the following should be denoted: synthetic, analytic, a priori. Where the analytic is a proposition which is true by virtue of their meaning. Synthetic is a proposition that relates to the world. Diagrams from notes. Latest, May 2nd, 2017. Random Historic Geometric Thoughts. Page 2. Begin dileotheistic graphs. Noted previous notes. Primitives and primitive notes. Purple, silver, and gold. Boo Book. Tangential. Also red ink postcard notes. Isomorphic relations between graphics, language, to symbolic logic are assumed adequate at times and inadequate at other times. In the read of this material, one may have to oscillate between the two and give some associative allowance to bridge the propositional with the graphic. Here, I don't so much mean the noting of a domain, but how to philosophically imagine meaningful content of a shape. Here I may speak of square circles. Note chapter contradiction examples below. Alterityism. Adverb. The alterity of all possible positions, not beyond its own self-reproach. Differing from relativism in that alterityism substantiates positive philosophical approaches and methodologies which run contra in antagonism to any philosophy or idea presented, is of a class of anti-foundationalism. A very form of utilizing any other position to substantiate an alternative to what is presented. Alterityism is about always finding the alterity of any position statistically held system. By its virtue, alterityism is apositional. Alterityism includes intersectionality of contrary ideas, or combinatorial intersections between schools, positions of ideas. Functions also as a means of debate which keeps an altering reflection back to one's opponents, such as to undermine the position of the other, destabilize the quest towards and notions of truth, yet not for relativism nor adroit skepticism to settle in, but to use relativism and skepticism as pools to mire through in order to reemerge. So I was hoping with this writing to bridge opposing propositions and positions into a plurality of complexity such that exasperation and mental exhaustion prevails. Then I suspect a deflation or diminishment should occur, which when deflated greater acceptance of differences is allowed and a bridge of reconstruction can begin. Nounous and verbose forms. Static yet potential versus mutable and kinetic forms of engagement. See dileotheism opposed to trivialism. Identicals and identity. Identicals allow for distinction between that which is the same. Identity via the law of identity uses A equals A as a syntactic identicals. Yet certainly the left A is not the same as the right A, such that one's acceptance of A equals A as a law has some wiggle room. The formula law uses the principle of being identical to form its static position. The goal is to reapproach the law A equal A not as static set, left parenthesis, A equals A, right parenthesis, but as divisible units, A right parenthetical, equals left A, or the generative grammar capital A equals lowercase a, such that the meaning can sustain, but a difference can be noted. Read left to right. Pushback as criticism. By attempting to destabilize identity, one also destabilizes the concepts and ideas around truth and what might be referred to as true. Of the concept script within math via Frege, a function is that in that it denotes the non-possibility of the variable to be anything other than itself, e.g. x minus y, where x is the function, the static declarative of the math which proceeds from it, often f of x. A means of destabilizing the function would be to add or acquire a contextual other variable to all functions, such that an aspect or context or background or relationship to the function is carried along with the function. E.g., x1 minus y might supplement currently accepted concept script. In this latter case, the 1 would be an exchangeable variable for any other variable denoting another relative aspect of the original single x. In this case, no function would be able to be presented without an entailed second variable, and the old concept script would go wayside. E.g., x would always have to be accompanied by another variable, xy or x1 or xz, etc., such that functions would be able to become mutable with regards to its definition. This, of course, would exist as a new kind of function, which intuitively many people might be adverse to accepting, yet its merit is to allot for all notions of difference of all variables, including the one which attempts to stabilize the remaining statement. A natural language would be equivalent to coding a subject with an aspect where if the aspect became pertinent, the situation, its declaration, would have sense, and without pertinence, the aspect would be superfluous. E.g., when Jack wears his yellow sweater, he seems happier than when he wears his blue or any other color sweater. Or, the sky, blue, seems lower today, opposed to the sky black seems lower tonight, where sky is the subject, and the accompanying predicate would always be entailed. The action might group subjects to the predicate in, let's say, an economic discussion, such as follows. Capitalism, in its purest form, has helped bring humanity out of poverty more so than any other economic system. And compared to socialism, where distribution of funds are rabid, we see governmental collapse. One might here make the descriptive claim that capitalism has never existed without an element of socialism, so that what should be described in the entailed unit of the description, capital socialism, whereby we could say within the West we have an economic system of capital socialism whereby private and corporate entities build internal wealth from a finite pool of money units, and a portion of this wealth noted as profit is taxed, whereby the tax is distributed to many other aspects or divisions of society, which allows for the common of private and corporate entities to persist and emerge. In this case, the variable of x, where x equals capitalism, would be entangled necessarily with the same descriptive other aspect, in this case socialism, being y, would both cease to lose their autonomy within the discourse and would be combined in a module as xy. In the new combinations of functions as required to be dual in nature, we might find this problematic when wanting to isolate units as elemental, primary, or singular and speak about them in the context of having no context. We historically do this so that we can produce nouns within language in which to describe other attributes surrounding said noun, or what the noun is doing, aka denoting the verb or verbose aspects to the noun as subject. So in one huge manner, I'm proposing an embedded recursion of sorts from the outset. Keep in mind that this is only proposed as an exercise which can be employed to destabilize identities. We are quite accustomed to identities as it is part of our teaching objects and things to children within the world, but this proposal couples the objects and things taught with the contextual ground, contrast, aspects, or perspective from the outset. The introduction of this process is utilized to suppose an exception to all definitions, as definitions are generally reductive descriptions of identities, such as triangles, squares, circles, bachelors, evens, odds, numbers, etc., and in order to, let's say, speak of a caveat to the statement, all bachelors are unmarried men, or introducing a caveat whereby we can speak of square circles, aka squirrels. Some caveating or exceptional domain or consideration is allowed. Contradiction's logical explosion, its containment into compartments, associative indexing, and the discontents. Logical explosion is a term used to explain how if the law of non-contradiction is violated or allowed to stand as true, then any variable that is not identical with the first can replace the second, namely, A and not A. A thing is and is not itself at the same time in the same manner. So for all is-nots, any other variable or thing can replace the is-not. If logical explosion occurs via contradiction, bracket, A and not A, or A equals not A, then I ask myself to what extent the explosion or the elimination of the contrary variable, not A, is substituted with any arbitrary variable. But more importantly, to what extent can the substitutable variable be relegated to a tangential or associative variable? So to say, if A equals not A occurs, and any replaceable P variable can substitute for not A, then a contradiction follows. But paraconsistent logic, like diletheism, is a different way of managing the logic, a weaker sense. Another paraconsistent logic is what I'm proposing in this text, a relational anti-intuitist logic, one where Derrida's difference imbues itself into the logic, that an act of deferring to the next is practiced. And with Derrida, this is done in semiotics, whereby all difference is assumed by not only each progenitor of language, language speaker, but by each signified that is reapproached or replaced in an adjacent or an adjacent imbricated fashion, such that there is layered common domain, a common domain of commonly chosen items, variables, which are most often mentioned when saying that any variable can follow. To illustrate what I mean, let's take the logic of logical explosion and assume that for all possible variables, we will reject all variables that have no relational or associative meaning with the original variable, such that the deictic word like you would require a context. Let's say it's the reader of this thesis. So I could speak of you as A, you equal A, and assuming that not A is every variable besides you, like your shirt, pants, shoes, hairdo, about you. These items are all contextual to you without being you per se. So as you speak of all contextual variables about you that define you and surround you and are of you, to and towards you, point to you particularly, this didactic field is unique to every variable, and in this case, this didactic field is relevant to only you, such that A equal you and not A equals all context-oriented variables about you, pointing or indicating you, which you choose. They're para, running alongside you, consistent with you, particularly or generally. You, the reader, is A and not A, in terms of being the single human being cut off from the world at your skin's edge, and all that define you in terms of your context, an embedded self, which is publicly, colloquial speaking, also you. So in this case above, and for all not A, we relegate a proximity of elements of the A limited domain of not A's, so to speak. Another way of ascertaining all not A's, not A, is to grant over the word any without a limited domain. Yet note the following: even any variables allowed, when supplemented, hold a gradient type of domain. So the domain of all variables which people choose when speaking about contradiction. But when referring to an item other than oneself, often they might say, if X equals not X, then anything follows. So X equals dog, a chair, the color yellow, etc. So it is here to which I look at what is chosen items most commonly, which English-speaking people say when referencing colloquial any variable. So in this case, I use the words dog, chair, and yellow. Now all I have to do is create a statistical database of all the supposed arbitrary variables which logicians use when describing that which occurs as a consequence of logical explosion, in order to find the domain of first-order associations. This is a psychocultural statistic of evaluation at this stage of speaking, yet not irrelevant. So after I gather a data set of commonly used first-order associations post-logical explosion, I have what I might make an analogy to, which is the rings of Saturn. The most interior ring is defined by the first list of supposedly arbitrary variables, dog, chair, and yellow, and then the second order would be an analog to the second ring, hat, the, eggnog. The third ring, double, ring, blah, and so on. The point of this collection of limited data sets collected is to find not only a teaching or didactic list from philosophy, teachers, professors, as a non-arbitrary set of claimed arbitrary variables, but to also speak to the raw associations a schizoaffective patient might mentally link to, when their mind may be facing the abyss of all possible lexical variables, which their mind, bereft of naming the signifiers arising in their mind, might first come to remake sense of the world. Certainly, it is a priori logically sound to say that with the function x, where x equals not x, the not x is substitutable for any other item of discourse. Yet psychologically, a species-specific data collection of what people say is their example of what an arbitrary not X might be, becomes the basis from which a madman or therapist of a madman might utilize to re-coordinate the mind of those who have been deemed to have lost theirs. The relativistic nature of a logically arbitrary system may still have a statistical constraint upon what is deemed relative, as to limit the type kind of supposedly arbitrary answers one might give. And although this data set might be collected from many sane people, the set itself might be telling of how the madmen might regroup a mental grounding from which to find order within the chaos of their mind. I compliment this idea as it was by this means which I was able to personally put back together a coherence of reality which resembles the grounding of my pre-psychotic mind. And in this coming back to a sanity which allowed me to theorize about a component-based module of truth, aka truth as modular. All is in flux, and all is different. If X is a cup, which I hold and discern to merely be a cup, and to you the cup has some sentimental value, the cup is not merely a cup to you. The cup to you may be capital X. Yet we are speaking of the same cup, such as to say lowercase x equals uppercase x, maintaining identity but differing in equivocal definition. The lowercase x is equivocal to a mere cup, where the uppercase x is equivocal to a sentimental cup. Some dissonance should emerge. This is like plural tantum, such as scissors and fish. But the indexing these types of words is composed and contrasted with the idea hypostasis. To hypostaticize, like a hypostatic union. In this case, though, consider dog and dogness. That the dog has dog-like qualities or aspects of its being, which together allows a dog to be both specific and individual as well as general and distinct of a category. This is a type of contradiction or paradox. Dog and dog qua dog. Perhaps move the section below to the other place within the book. Someone asked me, when a contradiction occurs, how do you know which one to accept and which one to reject? A contradiction is often the x equals x, whereby the x is no longer, or in some capacity, fits itself, where the identity of the first utterance or referent is mixed into the conflated to that of another conflation or fused meaning, such that the identity itself is no longer means what the first X referenced exactly. To answer the question, consider that definitions are already unstable and often migrate or are migratable, entangle and are entangleable. When one reaches a limit of vocabulary or their vocabulary's descriptive power, they often use reiteration to demand a type of imprinting or to heavily suggest what they are saying, the orientation that they wish the other which they are in communication with, their interlocutor, to speak in verbatim mimicry to what they firstly were saying. People want general agreement about terms and definitions in order to suffice some conversation or utility needing to be performed within day-to-day life. Yet these people are often antagonized if their cadence and tone are mimicked. An object identification X may, to the speaker, be the subject of the conversation, where the listener engaging in conversation may presume X as a generalizing topic, and hence, by being a topic, may have content within which can be reducible. Here we will have a contradiction, or diction, which in a contra to the individual signified. When one speaks of trees, trunks, and branches in a way to express the idea and identifiable concept of climbing a tree via using their hands and arms to pull them up into branches, but assumes that the X, tree, signified is deciduous, and the subject of the conversation about X, where X equals trees, Yet the other person in dialogue who also held x equals trees must bifurcate the definition and note that x does not equate to trees generally, as the idea of climbing a dense 25-foot pine tree seemed unencumbering and masochistic at best. So the listener found that x equals x was actually x does not equal x, as trees generally, and reduced the contradiction to the subset of trees. Pinus, x, tree, is parsed away and rejected, where the deciduous x tree is accepted, and the appropriated clarifying supplement of the original x. The supplementing of x via topical reduction can continue on if the story of the initial x tree climbed needed further clarity or reduction. But this is often not the case found in philosophical discourse. Oftentimes, definitions and variables are held firm and unbudgeable between conversationalists whom are not able to skin a cat of contrary definitions in any other way. They often become heated and insistent as this junctures and the word on civil resolution instead of reconsidering definitions which they ardently hold as static. Here we have unproductive conversations where people begin talking past one another, and an insistence upon exact expression held in conflict opposed to exercising miotny. Exegesis and eisegesis, point of view, propositions, propositional knowledge, propositional states, attitudes towards propositional states, beliefs as attitudes towards propositional states. Epistemologists mostly believe Gettier cases questions justified true belief. So there are two species of relationship towards propositional ideas. One within and outwardly attitudinal to a factor or variable fact, which is different than recognizing, for example, that when I look out my window and I see my environment, I am not necessarily moving a proposition through my mind about what I phenomenologically witness, nor do I necessarily then speak on the topic, consciously nor unconsciously, nor necessarily have an experience of an internal monologue. Some people, and people sometimes witness the world accompanied by a substrate of words moving before their mind's eye, either visually or auditorily, where others at other times have an absenting of such word relations accompanying their mind's apprehension of the world. Some people are pigeon-toed, and others walk bow-legged like ducks. Although some people walk relatively straight with their feet moving parallel one another, I'm speaking about those who are duck-footed, perhaps bow-legged. I, for example, being duck-footed, can always be reminded of a triangle shape, heels pointing to one angle, and the imagined line between my front two toes, composing the other two angles. I, too, also put the tip of each of my feet equally away from any single object, such that I can imagine and experience my imagination of an inferred triangle, if you will. This projected geometry relocates the domain of the referred and now points to the world, to the imagined domain fields. In this case, the imagined platonic triangle comes to mind. Words that take on mental modality, such that what is said relates also to what one can both see of the real empirical world and that of the imagined overlaying via projection upon the world, function in concert. This analog of the projected mental form upon the empirical world of objects exacts itself in this, a dual thought process, not unlike the people who can see the word with a dual aspect of having words run alongside their mind's eye when witnessing the empirical world. The ability to overlay is of the experiencer and can be illustrated or enunciated. In both cases, this ability is subsumed by the modern Western philosophical canon into that of one's consciousness, and hence stemming from the domain of phenomenology. In another case, to know of an experience is spoken from an epistemological domain. Here, a philosopher might employ the binary of descriptive and prescriptive grammars. The ontologist's playground, or understanding, is that of what is, or wrongly said, that which bees, the being nature and the nature of being. Here we have another diagram, epistemology, ontology, and phenomenology overlaid amongst one another. The intersection of all is pointed to with an a posteriori knowledge experience. These three domains can inflate and deflate, eclipsing over the other two depending on preference. This is the end of this reading. We will continue on the next video.